This will be very short, and there are no slides because I'm willing to commit to very little with respect to this. It's very much a work in progress. We have, you may have seen in the news or on the Fifth Estate last year that the issue of McIntyre powder was sort of revived by a community activist in Elliott Lake, whose father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And it was suggested to her that this could be related to the McIntyre powder exposure, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, was in the gold mines and uranium mines of northern Ontario at the McIntyre mine, which is where it got its name. An occupational physician who joined up with a scientist or two at the University of Toronto decided that creating respirable aluminum dust and having miners breathe this in before their shifts would protect the miners from developing silicosis. So they did some animal experimentation and some human experimentation on workers who already had silicosis, and decided that this was both an effective prevention mechanism and an effective treatment for silicosis. And starting in the mid-40s at the McIntyre mine, began requiring the workers to breathe it in for 10 minutes. So they would close the doors to the change room. The powder came in a little cylinder about the size of a 35 millimeter film canister, and at the end of a compressed air line, there's a little chamber to put it in, would puncture it at both ends, and then use the compressed air to fog the changing room. When there was some research conducted in the late 80s, the researchers estimated that the annual alveolar burden of the aluminum dust was about 10 times the normal body burden of aluminum. Pardon me. So then in the, it sort of expanded and grew, and in the late 70s, the Fifth Estate did what by today's standards is almost a parody of an investigative journalism show, where they went to the McIntyre mine and the mine superintendent refused to let them film what the powder looks like when it's being distributed. They interviewed scientists around the world about whether or not this seemed like a good idea and an effective prevention measure or treatment, and then filmed the head of the McIntyre Research Foundation as the sweat formed on his brow and then ran down his face while they confronted him with this information. And within a year, the use of this technique had stopped. Now, the formal mechanism of doing that was a committee of scientists who also suggested that it should be studied to see if there were any ill health effects arising from it. So it was proven that it didn't help anything, but did it hurt anything? And the Ministry of Labor did crunch some numbers regarding respiratory conditions in the 80s, which haven't been reviewed, so I'm not vouching for them, that showed no damage there. But there was still this concern regarding neurological conditions. There's one published study, so if you're interested, the place I would recommend you go to is the, Janice Martel is the name of the community activist who resuscitated this issue, has a website that's just McIntyrePowderProject.com. And if you go to the links page from there, it has both the 1979 Fifth Estate documentary, a follow-up that was done last year, the Ontario miners study that I'm about to talk about very briefly, and an Australian miners study. And what the Ontario miners study found was that although there was no increase in neurological disorders within their sample, which unfortunately got whittled down to about 300 exposed and non-exposed miners by the end of the day, the rate of cognitive impairment was such that between the unexposed and exposed, and then as they stratified the length of exposure, was extremely significant. There was a great cognitive decline. So that's the only study to date of the Ontario miners and possible neurodegenerative results of this treatment. What Janice started to do was to create a voluntary registry of people who believe they might have health conditions arising from the dust. And then we agreed with the steel workers to have what we call intake clinics, which is that we invite people to come in who believe that they've had the health effects, and create files for them, take their work histories, do exposure histories, medical histories, and now we are going to be looking at those files in more detail. We had 150 cases brought to our clinics in Timmins of mostly gold miners, 120 of mostly uranium miners in Sudbury, and we're anticipating having about 325 or 350 by the time that we mop up the people who are still waiting for attention. And now we're starting to put all the information into databases and look for research partners to carry it forward a bit. So.